Hello, everyone. This is Austin Kraft here to talk about argument possibilities in the object voice of East Javanese Indonesian. Take it away.
Excellent. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Austin. Really happy to be here. It's been a great conference thus far with really interesting talks. I'm a recent graduate with my BA and BS from the University of Minnesota, and I'm going to be talking about recent research that I've done on the object voice among speakers of East Javanese Indonesian. So to get things started, a bit of an intro or a refresher for many of us on grammatical voice in Indonesian, starting with sort of a standard Indonesian perspective here, exemplified in one, we see a three-part voice system with active voice constructions as in 1A, with dia sudah membeli buku itu, and then a passive construction, or sometimes called the D-passive construction, named after the passive morpheme D, as in buku itu sudah dibeli oleh dia, where this agent phrase is optional. And third, we have what's called the object voice, what I will refer to as the object voice in this talk, sometimes referred to as passive type 2, objective voice, and several other names, with a sentence like buku itu sudah dia beli, where we have an obligatory agent in standard Indonesian, and it obligatorily is a pronoun. So this talk is going to home in on the object voice and this perceived kind of flexibilities in the morphosyntax of the object voice in East Javanese speakers, in speakers of East Javanese Indonesian. Looking at standard Indonesian, just to get one basis for comparison as we move forward, standard Indonesian has two particularly prominent requirements in the object voice, namely that the agent is a pronoun or a pronoun substitute, and that auxiliaries or negation precede the agent. And this is exemplified here in 1C replicated here. Next, another piece to keep in mind, to have in perspective, is that neither of these restrictions unilaterally apply across Austronesian object voices. Just in earlier talks in previous blocks of AFLA this week, we've seen object voice constructions that don't abide by these standard Indonesian requirements, and it's also been documented in previous literature. So now I would like to introduce a motivating puzzle here in East Javanese Indonesian, summarized by this quadruplet here. Let's see. Great. One moment, thanks. Okay, sorry, just technical issue on my end. So this quadruplet here, we have the canonical object voice for reference here in 2A, and then we also have the some variants that we see are being possible in East Javanese Indonesian, namely, we look along these two factors. First, a pronoun agent. First an auxiliary agent ordering, seeing that compared to a canonical object voice, as in 2A, a sentence like 2B is also possible, where the agent precedes the auxiliary. And if we look to the other factor of pronoun agent, we see that non-pronoun agents, as in 2C, appear to be possible. And applying, both of these factors counter to the standard Indonesian requirements, as in 2D, we see that non-pronoun agents, as well as agent auxiliary ordering, are possible. And so at first glance, this suggests a stark contrast to the distribution of the object voice in East Javanese Indonesian compared to standard Indonesian. So in standard Indonesian, we see specifically, as in this table, it must be a pronoun agent and any auxiliary must precede that agent. Whereas this quadruplet that we previously observed looks like, at first glance, something like this, something much more expansive, which leads us to the main guiding question here of what constitutes the object voice in East Javanese Indonesian, namely with respect to these two kind of axes related to the pronoun status of the agent, as well as relative ordering of agent and auxiliary. To summarize my proposal before we get into evidence that backs it up, I'll look at this quadruplet again, where with canonical object voice word ordering as our reference, we see that sentences like 2B will find evidence to suggest that it's active voice topicalization in line with previous research that's looked at sentences like these, and bolstered by additional diagnostics. For the sake of time, I won't go into sentences like 2D, but that general analysis will extend there from 2B. 2C is where things I think get quite interesting, where I will find that sentences like these may be instances of active voice topicalization as well as focus movement. And so an interesting conclusion that we'll draw from this is that 2C, despite having at a high level the same constituent order as 2A, is not object voice, from which it follows that word order is necessary but not sufficient in indicating grammatical voice in East Javanese Indonesian. And then a fun sort of further kind of enriching fact that we see is that some non-pronoun agents are still possible in East Javanese Indonesian object voice. And I'll present evidence to suggest that this categorical pronoun, non-pronoun requirement that we see, say, in standard Indonesian is insufficient here, that this account appears to require some sort of prosodic consideration. So I will show that this table here, this revised table, is a bit more reflective here. So in addition to what we see in standard Indonesian, we see that under some conditions, non-pronoun agents are acceptable in East Javanese Indonesian. To get things started with some diagnostics, we're going to be looking at the contrast in 2A and 2B replicated here. And we're going to, our sort of guiding question for this voice diagnosis of is this object voice, is we're going to look at the structural position of the theme. Is it in spec TP? As we get into these diagnostics, a few principles to keep in mind. We'll take Indonesian as to be an SVO language, and also be mindful that the consultants, that the variety that they speak, like other varieties of Malay Indonesian, permits A-bar movement, say WH movement, of the internal argument in active constructions when this nasal mung prefix is absent. So with a sentence like 3A, instance of WH movement of the internal argument is possible when and only when this mung prefix is absent. So with these facts in mind moving forward, that A-bar movement is possible in this variety when the verbal prefix is absent, we look at a sentence like 2 and could see, intuitively that perhaps this is an instance of, say, topicalization, as it could just be fronting of something that is underlyingly active. And our evidence shows that this intuition holds. The first diagnostic will be an adaptation of Chung's tools, namely with control. So we're going to look at two sentences here in 4, minimally different just based on relative ordering of the agent and the auxiliary. Throughout this talk, green indicates canonical object voice word ordering, and this sort of orangish peach is the inversion of that agent auxiliary ordering. So we're going to embed these under the same matrix clause, and we get strict and distinct interpretations when I spoke with the consultants about this, namely with a sentence like 5A, we get the meaning, I buy the book for you to be able to read it, for you to be able to read this particular book. Whereas when we diverge from canonical object voice word ordering under the same matrix clause, we get a sentence that would translate to, I buy the book for you to be able to read. And the judgments were quite strong in terms of acceptable sort of meaning or context behind this, namely a sentence like 5B being acceptable where the speaker is presenting a book to the addressee, and the addressee does not yet know how to read, say, speaking to a child. And these interpretations, an upshot from them is that the theme is indeed in spec TP in 4A to yield this control interpretation, whereas in 4B, where we do not have canonical object voice word ordering, the theme is not in spec TP, but I would say further up in the left periphery, and we'll get into further diagnostics now. I'd be happy to get in during the question period some further discussion of this schematics for those interested in the technical side of how these interpretations bear out in the structural analysis. And now we'll look to indefinite themes, and you may recall from the previous block with Hero's talk on object voice in Javanese that there was that the sensitivity to definiteness suggested that in the object voice in that variety of Javanese, that the subject and object voice constructions that the theme and object voice constructions occupied a topic position. Here, however, we see, with that same sensitivity to definiteness in mind, that sentences like 7a with canonical object voice word ordering are, that they hold up to indefinite themes, whereas we see a significant degradation without the canonical object voice word ordering, again suggesting that when we have agents before the auxiliary, we do not have object voice, but rather a topicalization of an underlyingly active construction. And third, we looked at prosody. Introduction of a pause after the theme either maintains or improves the quality of these sentences that do not have object voice word ordering. And so this may not be conclusive evidence on its own, but is definitely, aligned with works like Musgrave's on the prosody and Indonesian topicalizations, and especially in concert with these other two diagnostics, lead us to an intermediate conclusion that if the agent precedes the auxiliary, we don't have object voice, but rather topicalization of an underlyingly active construction. Moving on to the other primary contrast that we're going to focus on here, the contrast between 2A and 2C. Now, they appear to have the same overall kind of constituent order. However, I will show that it's the result of both topicalization as well as focus movement. First, going back to prosody, we see that the introduction of a pause, perhaps more strongly here as a piece of evidence than we had previously used as a diagnostic, can be crucial for some speakers to accept a sentence like 2C, reminiscent of topicalization. So further going along that topicalization line of inquiry, we look to indefinites. And we see a degradation when we have an indefinite theme and a non-pronoun agent as an 8B versus a canonical object voice configuration as an 8A. Now we could just go to say that yes, it's topicalization of an underlying active construction. However, it looks like we have a bit more work to do here, as when we were looking at 2B, the auxiliary followed the agent, which would be active voice relative ordering, whereas in 2C, we still have a bit more work to do to derive this word order. So my proposal is that a sentence like 2C is an instance of auxiliary fronting as focus movement occurring in addition to topicalization, a possibility that's previously been brought up in the literature. And these sentences in 9 and 10 show how focus movement on its own as in 9, as well as focus movement in tandem with topicalization can occur as in 10 here, with using actually an overt focus marker for the purpose of being explicit with this sort of illustration that it is a possibility. So an intermediate conclusion that we have here is that a sentence, again, like 2C, cannot or it is not necessarily object voiced, even though it has the constituent ordering that we've come to see with Indonesian object voice. Now, the previous section had just suggested if we don't see a pronoun, or if we see an agent that's not a pronoun, that it's not object voice. But looking further at more data in the diagnostics that we're using suggests that there may actually be instances of object voice with non-pronoun agents. So one of the sort of triplets of findings that has led us to this exciting complication is the set in 11, where namely 11A and 11B is a contrast that we've seen previously in the diagnostics, whereas with 11C we have something that's very much not a pronoun agent, but is still acceptable under with an indefinite theme. And so we run into problems if we say that a sentences like 11B are would be derived by active voice topicalization. In a sentence like 11C, if we say it's derived by active voice topicalization, much more difficult to reconcile the acceptability of something that's not supposed to be topicalizable. And so we're seeing that some, but not all, non-pronoun agents appear to be permissible in the object voice. As we move towards an account of the distribution of object voice agents, keep in mind some historical perspective of object voice, passive voice morphology, potentially descending from clitic agents attached to verbs. And so these prosodically light non-pronouns in East Javanese Indonesian being able to cliticize onto the verb would be in line with the prohibition against intervening material such as the temporal adverbial, which is not allowed as in 12A, but as soon as this intervener is moved away from an intervening position as in 12B, the object voice sentence is acceptable. And I'd be happy in the discussion period to get into the sentence 13, where we see that this intervention effect, the sensitivity to this intervention actually degrades when we're looking at those sentences that are that look like object voice, but we had said are actually underlyingly active and subject to topicalization and focus movement. The scope and methods used in the research thus far don't put us in a position to give a specific phonological unit at work here. What is the specific phonological unit that guides the distribution of object voice agents? But the results motivate further research in that direction. The contrast in 14A and B is rather it is a strong illustration that just by modulating whether you have adikku or adiksaya, where you have this possessor as a full word in 14b is the only factor that leads to this degraded judgment. So I present sort of a preliminary sketch that the object voice agent in East Javanese Indonesian and the verb must form a sufficiently small phonological domain, the specifics of which are to be determined in further work. And so it's not pronoun status. Pronoun status alone can't just distinguish between 14A and 14B. The account of object voice agents may hinge on ability to criticize to the verb from a sufficient sort of prosodic likeness. And to recap the findings that, thus far, returning to this initial quadruplet, and namely the first three here, we have the canonical object voice that is following our diagnostics of a theme being in the specifier of TP. But then when we look to the also acceptable sentence with the inversion of the agent and auxiliary, our diagnostics suggest that this is an instance of active voice topicalization. And when we look to the other kind of axis of flexibility of pronoun or non-pronoun status, as in 2C, we find evidence to suggest this as being active voice topicalization in concert with focus movement. And part of the proposal thus is that auxiliary agent relative ordering is a necessary ingredient in the East Javanese Indonesian object voice, as 2B shows us that it's necessary, but 2C shows us that it's not sufficient to indicate the object voice, that just because we have surface level word ordering suggestive of the object voice, it doesn't mean that we have it, that we have the object voice. And further, a complication that's enriching the findings is that the agent and the verb appear to when they appear to form a sufficiently small phonological domain, perhaps for the agent to function as a clitic, that sort of account, rather than categorical pronoun or non-pronoun status, appears to be the account for well-formed object voice constructions with respect to the agent. And with the last minute or two left of the talk before we proceed to discussion, I wanted to just look to some typological implications. For one, Nomoto's implicational hierarchy recently proposed on the languages of Malaysia and Indonesia, according to their permissible object voice agents, where we have these categories arranged hierarchically related to pronouns, kinship terms, proper names, indefinites, definites, and covert nominals. That, I mean, from this research, we get an more of like an enriched critical view of, just because a sentence appears on surface level to have to permit object voice under say with non-pronoun agents, we found that it's not always the case. It is sometimes the case, but not always. So it's an enriching finding in that respect. And I'm looking ahead to more formal accounts and on object voice agents, bolstering the diagnostic tests with, say, quantifiers that are themes that use quantifiers that are inherently non-topicalizable. So looking beyond just indefinites for that diagnostic. And then I'm exploring a variety of frameworks to account for well-formed object voice with non-pronoun agents. So cross-linguistically looking at obligatory head-head adjacency, noun incorporation, pseudo-noun incorporation, especially with unpromoted external arguments in non-active constructions that have been documented in both languages near, like neighboring Indonesian, as well as those quite distant. And that it's previously been proposed, the constraints on nominals that can fit, say, in the context of pseudo-noun incorporation could depend on language-specific constraints, for instance, whether or not possessors are permitted in the nominal. A complication here, again, to return to 14, is that some possessors, but not all possessors, are acceptable in object voice agents. So looking both to these accounts as well as those that take, say, phonological boundaries and domains and their relationship with syntactic dependencies as well. Finally, understanding the object voice agent distributions in the languages spoken in the area around Malang, around where this data was gathered, to overall get a more holistic picture of what's going on in the syntax and prosody of object voice in East Javanese Indonesian. And so with that, I will wrap up, leave my acknowledgements here. Look forward to the questions, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin, for that really wonderful talk. As usual, raise hands, make noise. Questions. Sandy.
Austin, that was a great talk, really clear, very beautiful data. I have a question about 2C. That's the necessary but not sufficient sentence. And my question is, so it's focus movement of the auxiliary, is that your suggestion?
Yes.
Your proposal? I was wondering if, what happened, okay. Aren't there sentences with more than one auxiliary-like element in them?
Yes, that can be.
What word orders are possible in such sentences? In sentences of type 2C when there is more than one auxiliary? I'm kind of thinking of negation. I can't remember there are other tense aspect type auxiliaries that wander in and out. And my curiosity concerns where the external argument is placed with respect to those additional auxiliaries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got the data to consult on. I will follow up with you on that. What comes to mind initially is actually, if I could take this opportunity to revisit something that I just mentioned in passing and potentially to come back to. A sentence like 13 could be suggestive. So this is going back to intervening material and how in the object voice we see going up to 12 here, 12a, intervening material between the agent and the verb is yield an ungrammatical sentence that we don't have that ungrammaticality when we in the object voice have something away from the that agent verb zone. And the consultants found sentences like 13 generally not to be as bad. And for some, it was a complete loss of that sensitivity to interference where we have this temporal adverbial. So it'd be suggestive that right. So if we're looking at 13 and keeping in mind this could be underlyingly active, that the something like perempuan tersebut besok akan jual rumah itu. I guess off the top of my head, I can't adjudicate specifically where it is structurally, but this would be suggestive of, since there is intervening material here that could be acceptable, namely this besok, that the agent would be somewhere above that.
Yeah, in a way that the other possibility, which would be that the auxiliaries would line up in front of, to the left of the external argument, would be more troublesome for a focus movement proposal because they don't obviously form a constituent. I mean, you could wave your hands in certain ways, so it's worth thinking about, I think.
Absolutely, thank you.
All right, our next question is from Lisa.
Hi, very interesting talk. Have you ever looked at cross control in East Javanese? I'm just
Right. Not yet, but it is on the radar, absolutely.
because we would be very happy. There's a group of us looking at it, and we've been wishing we wish either Achinese that has these full pre-verbal agent DPs had cross control, which it doesn't, or that Indonesian had full DP pre-verbal agents. And so, I'll even take a lightish DP sort of agent. So what was it, my sister or something, what you had? So we'd love to have so Paul Krager, I know, is there. Josina, I'm working on it with Elena Paul, Susie Vormbrandt, and Josina Vanderklok. That's the group working on it. But I know Paul Krager and Fraser have a nice paper on cross control. So we're following up, looking for evidence that the agents are really in the lower clause. So yeah, if you work on it, can you get back in touch?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And yeah, we'll look into it. And following up on actually on the previous question, it looks like, thank you, Paul, for sharing that example. No, a new question here. Yeah.
We next
Thank you
have
for
a
those
question
questions in the chat.
Rosina.
Can I go? Is that okay? No? Okay. I had a question about if you're about the indefiniteness test with sebuah buku, I think, and I was curious if your consultants had any sensitivity to specificity. So if they mentioned if it's a specific indefinite book or if it's just any book. Because other, like Sumarmo 1970 in his dissertation uses this feature specific or specificity as being the relevant feature instead of indefiniteness. And I think Bill Davies also mentions this, but I can't remember if it's for Javanese or for Indonesian.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't recall a distinction on specificity coming up. I'll have to go back and consult the data, but definitely something to be keeping in mind, especially looking at, especially how those sorts of interpretations related to specificity would bear out with other non-topicalizable elements in that position. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, I'll take the liberty of asking. Oh, sorry, Dan Kaufman, why don't you ask the question?
You can go ahead.
Sure. So there's this question about the size of the thing that can appear in this position, right? So Matt Pearson observes that the element which undergoes end bonding in Malagasy, the agent in the patient voice there, can be coordinated. So you can have a coordinate ergative argument in Malagasy undergoing end bonding. I wonder about the possibility of coordination in this position. Have you investigated that?
Some time ago, yeah, I did look into coordinate agents because I believe I was looking at a paper, one of Arca's papers about coordinate agents in Balinese, where in reference to that, I was looking into coordinate agents, and it didn't seem to be possible to have coordinate agents here.
Right. Dan Kaufman, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, related to that, I looked at coordinate agents in this construction, I think, but it's important, I think, or I don't know, maybe it's important to understand kind of the history of this construction, because it really starts out as a clitic position, and then the
Mhm.
clitic becomes a wedge for a full phrase. And it's, I think, pretty clear if you look at classical Malay, how this happened. Basically, Malay enters into this Sprachbund pattern of avoiding pronouns for politeness reasons. So even first person pronouns become impolite. So instead of saying aku, you have to say hamba, like slave or something like that. And then you end up with phrasal replacements like your slave. And then you get larger and larger constituents in what used to be this proclitic position. So standard Indonesian kind of froze at a stage where, I mean, like the real, you know, whatever they call it, the really prescriptive version of standard Indonesian, froze at a stage where only the first and second person clitics were procliticized. And so even when you get these full phrasal replacements, they must have a first or second person interpretation. And if they have a third person interpretation, then they have to appear after the verb with the D prefix. So I think that speakers, it's tricky sociolinguistically to get at this data, because speakers are answering on the basis of colloquial, right? I mean, a lot of your data is really very standardish, right? It's not exactly, I don't think it's colloquial really, any kind of really colloquial variety, right? So if you say like perempuan tersebut, that's already evoking a very formal register to which the syntax then has to accommodate. So I mean, one very tricky thing here is really to make sure that the register, well, that you're just checking for register, because the different registers have very different syntaxes for this phenomenon.
Absolutely, yeah. In the sessions with the consultants, yeah, definitely something to continue to keep in mind. In the sessions with the consultants, I spend some time with the consultants trying to get them familiar with the data and the sort of judgments, especially to help kind of broaden the perspective beyond just asking, is this prescriptively a good sentence? And just providing a sort of judgment system where it's to indicate whether sentences are acceptable, you know, say in a formal setting, but also would this be something to be said to friends as well? So yeah, absolutely something to keep in mind moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so why don't we conclude here?